The morning sun glinted off the polished hood of a black sedan as it rolled to a smooth stop at an intersection. Inside the car sat Dana Williams, her sharp eyes scanning the bustling streets of Sacramento. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, she exuded an air of calm confidence, the kind that only came from years of hard-earned experience. Dana wasn't just any professional, she was the chief of internal affairs for the Sacramento Police Department, a role that demanded integrity, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The soft hum of the car's engine was suddenly interrupted by the wail of a police siren. Dana glanced in the rearview mirror to see flashing red and blue lights bearing down on her. She sighed, pulling over to the side of the road. A routine traffic stop, she thought, or at least it should have been. As she waited, Dana observed the officer approaching her vehicle. His stride was brisk, almost aggressive, his hand resting conspicuously on the grip of his holstered firearm. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his uniform with a rigid, almost intimidating posture. His name tag read Officer P. Mitchell, and as he approached, his face carried a look of impatience tinged with something more, a barely concealed disdain. Dana rolled down her window, her expression neutral. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Officer Mitchell didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked over her, lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "License and registration," he barked, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. Dana complied, retrieving her documents and handing them over without a word. She watched as Mitchell scrutinized them, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't genuinely interested in her response. "I'm not sure, but I'd like to hear your explanation," Dana replied calmly. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "You failed to come to a complete stop at that intersection back there. That's a violation." Dana nodded, her expression composed. "I see. If that's the case, I'll accept the citation." But Mitchell didn't move to write a ticket. Instead, he leaned closer, his tone dropping to one laced with irritation. "People like you always think you can get away with anything." The words hit Dana like a slap, not because they were loud, but because of the malice and prejudice behind them. Her gaze sharpened, locking onto Mitchell's. "People like me," she repeated, her voice steady, though it carried an edge of indignation. Mitchell stiffened, his jaw tightening. "You know what I mean," he said, doubling down on his earlier stance. "People who think the rules don't apply to them." Dana tilted her head slightly, her tone light but unmistakably challenging. "I follow the rules, officer. I also know my rights, and from where I'm sitting, this is starting to feel like something other than a traffic stop." For a moment, Mitchell hesitated. His posture grew more rigid, his frustration evident. He leaned in further, lowering his voice as though to mask his impatience. "Listen, if you want to get this over with quickly, you'll keep quiet and do as I say." Dana's eyes never left his. She crossed her arms, her demeanor unshaken. "Officer Mitchell, we both know that's not how this system is supposed to work. And I'm not going to stay quiet while you handle things the way you shouldn't." Mitchell's fists clenched at his sides, his composure starting to crack. He was used to having the upper hand, to intimidating people into submission. But Dana wasn't like anyone he had encountered before. Her calm defiance only served to heighten his frustration, exposing the insecurity beneath his authoritative facade. As the tension between them grew, Dana's voice cut through the charged silence like a blade. "People like me," she echoed again, her tone deliberate, her words slicing through the heavy air. "Tell me, Officer Mitchell, what exactly do you mean by that?" Mitchell flinched slightly, caught off guard by her directness. "That's not what I meant," he stammered, but the defensiveness in his tone betrayed him. Dana leaned back slightly, her expression one of profound disappointment. "Then what did you mean? Was it my skin color, the suit I'm wearing, or the fact that I won't let your authority intimidate me?" Mitchell's face reddened, his confidence unraveling with every passing second. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. Then, slowly, Dana reached into her pocket. Her movements were measured, deliberate, designed to avoid provoking the officer further. "I'm going to take something out," she said, her voice calm and controlled. "It's important. I want you to see it." Mitchell instinctively stepped back, his hand hovering over his holster. The move was reflexive, almost primal, and it spoke volumes about the fear and prejudice driving his actions. But Dana remained unfazed, her gaze unwavering. She pulled out a black leather wallet and opened it, revealing a gleaming badge. Holding it up for Mitchell to see, she spoke with quiet authority. "Dana Williams," she said, her voice firm. "Chief of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Police Department." Mitchell froze, his eyes fixed on the badge as if it were a mirror reflecting his every misstep. His face drained of color, and the confident mask he had worn so tightly began to crumble. In that moment, he wasn't just confronting Dana, he was confronting himself, his biases, and the system he represented. Dana's gaze didn't waver. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her tone steady but carrying the weight of her position. "This encounter isn't about a traffic violation anymore. It's about accountability, and I think we both know that." The silence that followed was deafening. Mitchell stood motionless, his authority stripped away, his every action laid bare under the piercing scrutiny of Dana's eyes. The balance of power had shifted, and both of them knew there was no going back. But the question remained, how far would Mitchell go to defend his crumbling facade? And how would Dana navigate the fragile, volatile tension that hung between them? The answers lay in the moments yet to come, as the line between justice and abuse of power grew increasingly thin. For a long moment, Officer Patrick Mitchell didn't move. His eyes darted between Dana's badge and her steady, composed face. The quiet confidence she exuded was unnerving, dismantling the fragile authority he had clung to so tightly moments before. He shifted uncomfortably, his throat working to find words, but none came. The weight of his missteps bore down on him, and it was clear he knew he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Dana kept her gaze fixed on him, her expression calm but unyielding. The silence wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, a tool she had learned to use in her role. Silence had power. It made people uncomfortable, forcing them to fill the void with their truths, whether they intended to or not. She could see Patrick squirming under that weight, his bravado unraveling with every passing second. He finally stammered, his voice quieter now. "I didn't realize who you were." Dana raised an eyebrow, her tone measured and deliberate. "And that matters because—" Patrick opened his mouth, but no answer came. He looked down at his feet, his frustration evident. The authority he had so confidently wielded earlier now felt like a heavy, ill-fitting coat he was desperate to shed. Dana leaned slightly forward, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "The uniform you wear, the badge you carry, they are supposed to represent justice, fairness, and respect. But what you've shown here today, that's something else entirely." Her words cut deeper than Patrick cared to admit. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, a nervous energy radiating from him. He had expected compliance, fear, maybe even anger. What he hadn't anticipated was this: a woman who not only refused to be intimidated but who also held the power to dismantle his actions piece by piece. Dana's mind raced as she assessed the situation. She wasn't just confronting Patrick for herself. This wasn't about ego or personal vendettas. It was about something bigger, something systemic. In her years as Chief of Internal Affairs, she had seen too many officers like Patrick, men who hid behind their badges to mask their insecurities, their prejudices. She knew the damage they could do, not just to individuals but to the very fabric of trust between law enforcement and the community. "I don't need a lecture," Patrick muttered, his voice tight. It was a weak attempt to reclaim control, but Dana didn't let it faze her. "What you need," she replied evenly, "is to understand the weight of your actions. Every word, every decision, it matters. It's not just about this stop, Officer Mitchell. It's about how you choose to represent the badge every single day." Patrick's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Dana could see the conflict in his eyes, a mix of resentment, shame, and defensiveness. She didn't need him to admit his fault right now. She just needed him to hear her. As the seconds stretched into an uneasy silence, Dana's thoughts drifted back to how she'd gotten here. She hadn't always been in a position of authority. Years ago, she was just another young woman navigating a world that often underestimated her. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, she had seen firsthand the disparities in how people were treated based on their skin color, their background, or even the way they spoke. Those experiences had shaped her, fueled her desire to fight for fairness and accountability. Her journey into law enforcement hadn't been easy. She had faced her share of skepticism, bias, and outright hostility. But she had persevered, climbing the ranks with a combination of grit, determination, and an unshakable belief in justice. Becoming Chief of Internal Affairs was more than a title, it was a responsibility, one she took seriously. And now, here she was, staring down an officer who represented everything she had worked to challenge. Patrick finally broke the silence, his voice defensive. "I didn't do anything wrong. You were the one who didn't stop at the intersection." Dana let out a slow breath, her patience unwavering. "This isn't about whether or not I stopped. It's about how you handled this situation. From the moment you approached my car, your actions were driven by something other than professional duty. And you know it." Patrick's face flushed, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. The truth of her words hung heavy in the air. Dana continued, her tone softening slightly but still firm. "Do you know how many complaints cross my desk about interactions like this? Do you know how many people walk away from encounters like this feeling powerless, disrespected, and mistrustful of the system? It's officers like you who make it harder for the rest to do their jobs with integrity." Patrick looked away, his hands fidgeting at his sides. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, and it was clear he didn't know how to handle it. Dana could see the cracks forming in his armor, but she knew she couldn't push too hard too fast. Change didn't happen overnight, and people didn't confront their biases just because someone pointed them out. It was a process, and it started with moments like this, moments that forced them to look inward, even if it was uncomfortable. "Why did you join the force, Patrick?" she asked suddenly, her tone less confrontational now. Patrick blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What? Why did you become a police officer?" Dana repeated, her voice steady. "What made you put on that badge in the first place?" Patrick hesitated, his brow furrowing. I wanted to help people," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Dana nodded slowly. "Then ask yourself this, is what you're doing today helping anyone? Is it building trust, respect, or understanding? Or is it tearing those things down?" Patrick didn't respond. The question lingered in the air, a challenge he couldn't ignore. The sound of a car horn in the distance broke the tension, and Dana glanced briefly toward the road behind them. Life moved on, oblivious to the quiet battle unfolding here. But for Dana and Patrick, this moment felt like the axis on which everything turned. Dana shifted slightly, her expression softening but her resolve unbroken. "You have a choice, Patrick. Every day, every interaction, you have the power to choose how you carry out your duty. You can use your authority to intimidate, or you can use it to inspire trust. But you can't have it both ways." Patrick's shoulders slumped slightly, a subtle but telling sign. For the first time, it seemed like her words were reaching him, breaking through the defensive walls he had built around himself. But Dana knew this wasn't over. It wasn't enough to plant the seed of doubt in Patrick's mind. The real challenge would come later, in how he chose to act moving forward. Would he confront his own biases, or would he double down on them? Would he learn from this encounter, or would he dismiss it as an anomaly? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement, Dana took a deep breath. She wasn't here to solve every problem in one conversation. She was here to hold a mirror up to the system and the people within it. And sometimes that was enough to spark change. But the road ahead was long, and the weight of the moment was far from lifted. For now, all she could do was wait and see what Patrick Mitchell would do next. The silence lingered between them, stretching into a fragile truce. Patrick still hadn't found the words to respond, and Dana didn't press him. Her words had landed, and she knew that the weight of them would settle deeper as time went on. But she also knew this wasn't the end of it. Confronting bias wasn't a single moment. It was a process, one that often involved resistance, denial, and, hopefully, eventual growth. Dana's thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of a car engine slowing down. She glanced to the side and saw a black sedan pulling over just a few feet away. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a middle-aged man with sharp features and a neatly trimmed mustache. He wore a suit that was just a little too crisp, a telltale sign of someone who spent more time in an office than on the street. "Everything okay here?" the man asked, his tone measured but curious. His gaze flicked between Patrick and Dana, his brow furrowing slightly as he took in the tension that hung in the air. Patrick stiffened, his body language shifting almost imperceptibly. Dana noticed it immediately. This wasn't just a random passerby. This was someone Patrick recognized, someone who carried authority in his eyes. "We're fine," Patrick said quickly, his voice a little too forceful. "Just wrapping up a traffic stop." Dana didn't respond right away. She studied the man in the car, noting the badge clipped to his belt. He wasn't in uniform, but his presence suggested he wasn't here by coincidence. The look he gave Patrick wasn't one of casual concern. It was the look of someone assessing a situation, gathering information. "I'm Dana Williams," she said, stepping forward slightly, "Chief of Internal Affairs. And you are?" The man's eyebrows lifted slightly in recognition, but his expression remained neutral. "Deputy Chief Alvarez," he replied, his tone polite but firm. "I oversee operations in this district." Dana nodded, her demeanor professional but guarded. "Then I'm sure you'll want to be briefed on what's happened here." Patrick shot her a quick, almost pleading look, but Dana ignored him. She wasn't here to shield anyone from accountability, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. Alvarez's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a sign that he was listening carefully. "Go on." Dana recounted the events of the stop in a calm, factual manner, leaving out no details. She didn't embellish, but she also didn't downplay the undertones of bias and intimidation that had colored Patrick's behavior. As she spoke, she kept her gaze steady on Alvarez, watching for any reaction. Patrick, meanwhile, stood rigid, his face a mix of frustration and unease. He didn't interrupt, but Dana could feel the tension radiating from him. This wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. It was about his career, his reputation, and the choices he had made that had brought them to this moment. When Dana finished, Alvarez let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "That's a serious accusation," he said, his tone measured. He turned to Patrick. "Is there anything you'd like to add, Officer Mitchell?" Patrick hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I was doing my job," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "She didn't stop at that intersection. That's why I pulled her over. And the rest?" Alvarez prompted, his tone pointed. Patrick shifted uncomfortably. I might have been a little too forceful," he admitted reluctantly, "but I didn't mean anything by it." Dana raised an eyebrow, her expression unimpressed. "Intent doesn't erase impact, officer. Your actions today weren't just unprofessional, they were dangerous. And if I hadn't been who I am, how far would you have taken this?" Patrick flinched at her words, but he didn't respond. Alvarez, meanwhile, was watching the interaction closely, his sharp eyes flicking between them. "This isn't the first time I've heard concerns about Officer Mitchell's conduct," Alvarez said finally, his tone careful. "But it's the first time I've seen it firsthand." Patrick's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "Sir, Save it," Alvarez said, cutting him off. "This isn't the time for excuses." Dana felt a flicker of satisfaction at Alvarez's response, but she kept her expression neutral. This wasn't about personal vindication. It was about ensuring that officers like Patrick were held accountable for their actions. "Chief Williams," Alvarez said, turning to her, "I'll ensure this is handled appropriately. You have my word." Dana nodded, her tone professional but firm. "I'll be following up to make sure it is." Alvarez gave her a small, approving nod, then turned his attention back to Patrick. "You're on administrative leave effective immediately," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Turn in your badge and weapon at the station. We'll be conducting a full review of your conduct." Patrick's face turned pale, but he didn't protest. He looked down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him, and there was no escaping it now. As Alvarez drove away, Patrick remained frozen in place, his hands clenched at his sides. Dana watched him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. She didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't a victory. It was just one small step in a much larger battle. "This isn't the end for you," she said finally, her tone softer than before. "But what happens next is up to you. You can learn from this, or you can let it define you. The choice is yours." Patrick didn't respond, but the look in his eyes suggested that her words had struck a chord. Whether he would take them to heart, however, remained to be seen. Dana turned and walked back to her car, her mind already racing with the implications of what had just happened. This wasn't just about Patrick, it was about the culture that had allowed officers like him to operate unchecked for so long. And she knew that changing that culture would take more than one confrontation. It would take persistence, courage, and a willingness to hold people accountable, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. As she started her engine and pulled back onto the road, Dana couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There were more battles ahead, more stories like this waiting to be uncovered. But she was ready, because this wasn't just her job, it was her mission, and she wasn't about to back down. As Dana drove away from the scene, her thoughts churned like a storm. The encounter with Patrick had left her shaken, not because she wasn't used to confrontation, but because it was a stark reminder of how deep the problem ran. She had faced moments like this before, where authority had been twisted into something oppressive, but seeing it up close again lit a fire in her. This wasn't just about Patrick Mitchell. It was about every person like him who thought they could wield power without accountability. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, an incoming call from her assistant, Mia. Dana tapped the hands-free button, her voice steady despite the whirlwind inside her. "Go ahead," she said. "Chief, I thought you'd want to know." Mia's voice came through, tinged with urgency. "I just got off the phone with Deputy Chief Alvarez. He's backing your report, but there's already chatter about pushback from the union. They're claiming Mitchell's rights were violated during the stop." Dana gripped the wheel tighter, her jaw clenching. It wasn't unexpected, but it was still infuriating. "Of course they are," she said evenly, though the edge in her voice was unmistakable. "Let them make their noise. The facts are on our side." "There's more," Maya said, hesitating slightly. "A reporter reached out. They heard about the incident and want to run a story." Dana exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She wasn't naive enough to think this would stay quiet, but the timing felt almost too convenient. "Who's the reporter?" "Jackson Ward," Maya replied. "He's with the Sacramento Chronicle. He's known for going after stories like this, especially ones that expose systemic issues." Dana considered this for a moment. Jackson Ward had a reputation for being relentless, but he was also fair. If he got wind of this, it could either be a catalyst for change or a firestorm of controversy, depending on how the narrative was framed. "Tell them I'll call him tomorrow," Dana said finally. "But make it clear, this isn't a story yet. We need to follow protocol before anything goes public." "Understood," Maya said. "And Chief, be careful. This feels bigger than usual." Dana nodded, even though Mia couldn't see her. "It always does," she said quietly, ending the call. The rest of the drive back to her office was uneventful, but the tension inside her only grew. She replayed the encounter with Patrick in her mind, dissecting every word, every gesture. There was something about his reaction, not just fear, but almost a sense of desperation. It was as if he wasn't just afraid of being caught, but of something deeper being exposed. When she arrived at the precinct, the air inside was thick with an unspoken tension. A few officers glanced her way as she walked through the halls, their expressions a mix of curiosity and wariness. She could feel the ripple effect of the day's events spreading already. In her office, Dana found a file waiting on her desk. It was from Alvarez, a preliminary report on Patrick Mitchell. She opened it carefully, scanning the contents. There were complaints, more than a few, about his behavior in the field. Nothing formal enough to trigger disciplinary action, but enough to paint a troubling picture. Dana's stomach turned as she read the accounts. each one echoing a pattern of subtle bias and overreach. And then there was a note at the bottom, written in Alvarez's hand. Asterisk Mitchell is close to someone high up. Be prepared for backlash asterisk. Dana leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. This wasn't just about one officer abusing his power. There were layers here, connections she hadn't seen yet. And if Patrick had someone protecting him, it explained his arrogance, his belief that he could act without consequence. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She looked up to see Alvarez standing there, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Dana gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing, his posture tense. "I made some calls after we left the scene," he said. "There's more to Mitchell's story than what's in that file. He's got ties to a local councilman, James Kincaid." Dana's eyes narrowed. Kincaid was known for his tough on-crime rhetoric and his unwavering support of law enforcement, no matter the circumstances. If he was connected to Mitchell, it could complicate things significantly. "Kincaid's already reached out," Alvarez continued. "He's calling this a misunderstanding and pushing for us to drop the investigation." Dana felt a surge of anger, but she kept her tone calm. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him we're doing our jobs," Alvarez said firmly. "But you need to know, he's not going to let this go. He'll use whatever leverage he has to protect Mitchell." Dana nodded, her mind working quickly. She wasn't surprised, but it added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. "Let him try," she said. "We're not backing down." Alvarez studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll support you, but we need to be smart about this. Kincaid has resources, and he's not afraid to use them." As Alvarez left, Dana sat back in her chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just about holding one officer accountable anymore. It was about taking on a system that protected people like him. And she knew it wouldn't be easy. The hours ticked by as Dana dug deeper into Patrick's history, cross-referencing his record with other complaints and incidents. Patterns began to emerge, connections that painted a larger picture of a system that had turned a blind eye for far too long. But with each piece of evidence she uncovered, the stakes grew higher. By the time she left the office, the sky was dark, and the streets were quiet. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was heavy, filled with the anticipation of what was to come. Dana knew she was heading into a storm, one that would test not just her resolve but the very principles she had built her career on. And as she walked to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for her next move. As Dana unlocked her car, a flicker of movement caught her eye in the shadows across the street. She paused, her instincts kicking in. The street was too quiet, the kind of stillness that wasn't natural. Her hand hovered near her phone, ready to call for backup if necessary. But after a few seconds of scanning the area, nothing seemed out of place. She shook her head, chiding herself for being jumpy. Sliding into the driver's seat, she turned the ignition, the hum of the engine breaking the silence. Her focus returned to the task ahead. Tomorrow would bring more battles, with the department, with Kincaid, and perhaps even with herself, as she navigated the fine line between justice and survival in a system resistant to change. The drive home was uneventful, but as she approached her house, a sharp unease settled over her. A black sedan was parked down the street. It wasn't a car she recognized, and its presence felt deliberate. Dana drove past it, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The car didn't move, but she noted the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat. She made a mental note of the license plate before pulling into her driveway. Inside, she locked the door and immediately checked her security system. Everything appeared intact, but the lingering sensation of being watched wouldn't fade. She stood by the window, peering out through the curtains. The sedan was still there, its engine off, the figure inside unmoving. Dana's phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. She glanced at the screen. It was Mia. Answering quickly, she kept her voice low, almost instinctively. "What's up, Maya?" she asked. "Chief, I just got an anonymous tip," Maya said, her tone urgent. "Someone sent a file to our secure email, claims to have information about Patrick Mitchell. I haven't opened it yet. Thought you'd want to see it first." Dana's pulse quickened. Forward it to me. I'll look at it now. Within seconds, her email pinged with the forwarded file. She opened it cautiously, her heart racing. The document contained photos, timestamps, and handwritten notes detailing several questionable meetings Patrick had over the last year. Most of them were with individuals linked to Councilman Kincaid. But what stood out was a series of surveillance photos showing Patrick handing an envelope to a man known for his involvement in under-the-table deals. The implication was clear. Patrick wasn't just a problematic officer, he was compromised. Dana leaned back, her mind racing. This was bigger than she had anticipated. The envelope exchange suggested corruption, possibly even illegal activities tied to Kincaid. The stakes weren't just professional anymore, they were criminal. And if this anonymous source was legitimate, it meant someone inside the system wanted her to expose it. But why now? And who could she trust with this information? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming outside. She froze, her eyes snapping to the window. The black sedan was gone. In its place, a man stood under the streetlight, his face obscured by a hood. He didn't move toward the house, didn't make any threatening gestures. He just stood there, as if waiting. Dana's hand instinctively went to her holstered weapon, her training taking over. She watched the man for what felt like an eternity, her mind weighing her options. Finally, she stepped toward the door, flipping on the porch light to signal she wasn't afraid. The man turned his head slightly, acknowledging the light, then slowly walked away down the street. She waited until he disappeared into the night before exhaling deeply. Her instincts told her this wasn't random. Whoever he was, he wanted her to know he'd been there. It wasn't a direct threat, but it was a message, and not one she could ignore. Back inside, she reviewed the anonymous file again, this time paying closer attention to the timestamps. Most of the meetings occurred late at night, often in secluded areas, but one location stood out, a warehouse near the riverfront, listed as abandoned but marked with recent activity in the notes. It was a bold choice for clandestine dealings, almost as if they believed no one would look there. Dana's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. No name, just a number she didn't recognize. The message read, *check the riverfront warehouse. Tonight, you're running out of time. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just a tip, it was a directive. Someone knew she had the file and was pushing her to act. But the timing felt off. Why would they want her to go now? In the middle of the night? It could be a setup, a trap to silence her before she could piece everything together. But if it wasn't? Dana grabbed her jacket and weapon, her mind already made up. She wasn't the type to sit back and wait. Whatever was waiting at that warehouse, she needed to see it for herself. She sent a quick message to Alvarez, letting him know where she was headed, but keeping the details vague. If something went wrong, at least someone would know where she'd been. The drive to the riverfront was tense, the city lights fading into the darkness as she approached the outskirts. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows dark, the surrounding area eerily quiet. Dana parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, her steps silent against the gravel. She scanned the area, her senses on high alert. Reaching the side of the building, she spotted a faint light flickering inside, barely visible through a crack in the door. She pressed herself against the wall, listening for any sounds. Voices, faint but urgent, reached her ears. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was happening inside. Dana edged closer to the door, her heart pounding. Peering through the crack, she saw Patrick Mitchell standing with two other men, their faces partially obscured by the shadows. One of them was holding a briefcase, his posture tense. Patrick looked nervous, glancing around as if expecting to be interrupted. The man with the briefcase opened it, revealing stacks of cash and a small black notebook. Patrick leaned in, saying something Dana couldn't hear, but his body language was clear. He was trying to assert control, though his unease betrayed him. The other man, taller and more imposing, stepped forward, closing the briefcase with a snap. He said something that made Patrick flinch, then gestured toward the back of the warehouse. Dana's breath caught as the taller man pulled out what looked like a folder and handed it to Patrick. Even from her position, she could see the Sacramento Police Department logo on the cover. Her mind raced. Was this stolen evidence? Sensitive information being sold or traded? She didn't have time to think further. Patrick turned suddenly, his eyes darting toward the door as if he'd sensed her presence. Dana stepped back into the shadows, her heart racing. She needed to get out of there and regroup, but not before she had proof of what she'd seen. Quietly, she pulled out her phone, snapping a series of photos through the crack in the door. The images weren't perfect, but they were enough to show Patrick, the briefcase, and the folder. It was all she needed for now. But as she turned to leave, her foot brushed against a loose piece of metal, the sound echoing in the still night. Inside, the voices stopped abruptly. Dana didn't wait to see what would happen next. She moved quickly, slipping back into the shadows and making her way to her car. As she drove away, her mind raced with possibilities. She had enough to prove Patrick was involved in something far more serious than abuse of power. But she also knew she just stepped into a much larger game, one that wouldn't end without consequences. And as she glanced in her rearview mirror, she saw headlights appear behind her. She wasn't alone. Dana gripped the steering wheel tighter, her eyes darting between the road ahead and the headlights following close behind. Her heart pounded as she tried to stay calm, calculating her next move. She couldn't lead whoever it was to her home. Not now, not when she was so close to unraveling the truth. Instead, she made a sharp turn down a side street, weaving through the quiet neighborhood with precision. The car behind her followed, unrelenting. She mentally mapped out her route, realizing she was heading toward the police precinct. It wasn't the safest destination given the circumstances, but it was the one place Patrick or his accomplices wouldn't expect her to go right away. She needed a buffer, a place where the trail could go cold. At the last second, Dana turned into a public parking garage, zipping up to the third level and pulling into a dark corner. She cut the engine and crouched low, watching as the car drove past the entrance without stopping. She exhaled in relief but knew the reprieve was temporary. Dana pulled out her phone, uploading the photos from the warehouse to a secure cloud drive. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't let this evidence be silenced. She sent a quick text to Mia with a single word, *proof*. Then, without waiting for a response, she opened her contacts and dialed Alvarez. "Dana, where are you?" Alvarez's voice was heavy with concern. "I'm fine for now, but it's bigger than we thought," she said, her voice low but steady. "I saw Patrick at the warehouse, exchanging money and sensitive police files. It's all tied to Kincaid. He's selling us out." There was a brief pause on the other end before Alvarez replied. "That explains a lot. Listen, I've been digging into Kincaid's connections. There's a paper trail leading right back to him, property deals, off-the-books accounts, even some names of officers he's been using to keep everything under wraps. But if Patrick's involved directly, we've got leverage." Dana's mind raced. "Then we need to act now. Patrick's scared, which means he's volatile. If we wait too long, he might destroy the evidence or worse." Alvarez hesitated. "Be careful, Dana. Kincaid isn't just going to sit back and let this unfold. If he senses we're closing in, he'll make his move." Dana ended the call and sat for a moment, her pulse steadying as she planned her next steps. She knew she couldn't rely on traditional channels. Too many people in the department were compromised. This would have to be surgical, precise, and fast. She decided to return to the warehouse, knowing she needed more to lock Patrick and Kincaid in place. When she arrived, the area was eerily quiet, the earlier tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. She crept back to the side of the building, listening for any movement. This time, it was silent. Inside, the warehouse was deserted, the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. The briefcase and documents were gone, but Dana noticed a single piece of paper fluttering on the ground near where Patrick had stood. She picked it up, her brow furrowing as she read the hastily scrawled note. *Meeting tomorrow. Midnight, Safe House 12. Her heart skipped a beat. Safe House 12 was an off-the-books property rumored to be used for unofficial department operations, one of those places that everyone knew about but never openly discussed. If Patrick was headed there, it meant this wasn't over. It was escalating. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Dana enlisted Mia and Alvarez, keeping the circle tight. They gathered everything they had on Kincaid, Patrick, and the warehouse dealings, building an airtight case. By nightfall, Dana was ready. She knew she couldn't risk going alone this time, so Alvarez agreed to back her up, staying close but out of sight. As midnight approached, Dana arrived at Safe House 12, parking a block away and approaching on foot. The building was nondescript, its windows darkened. She slipped through the back entrance, her steps silent on the creaking wooden floors. Voices echoed faintly from an upstairs room, growing louder as she ascended the stairs. Peering around the corner, Dana saw Patrick standing with Kincaid and two other men. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Kincaid was calm, his demeanor almost amused as he leaned against the wall. Patrick, on the other hand, was visibly nervous, his hand resting on the table near the briefcase. "You're losing your grip, Patrick," Kincaid said, his tone mocking. "That little stunt at the warehouse could have blown everything. You're lucky I'm giving you one last chance to clean this up." Patrick stammered, his voice lacking its usual bravado. "I've handled it. There's nothing left to trace back to us." "Are you sure?" Kincaid asked, stepping closer. "Because if you're wrong, it's not just your career on the line, it's your life." Dana's breath caught. She couldn't let this go any further. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the room, her badge held high. "It's over." The room froze, all eyes snapping to her. Patrick's face drained of color, while Kincaid's smirk faltered only slightly before he recovered. "Chief Williams," Kincaid said smoothly, "to what do we owe this unexpected visit?" "Spare me the pleasantries," Dana said, her voice cold. "I have evidence tying you to Patrick's activities, the warehouse, and those files. It's done." Kincaid chuckled, shaking his head. "You're bluffing. If you had anything, we wouldn't be standing here." Patrick's eyes darted between Dana and Kincaid, panic setting in. "She's not bluffing," he blurted. "She knows everything. She saw us at the warehouse." Kincaid's expression darkened as he turned to Patrick. "You idiot." Before anyone could react, Patrick grabbed the briefcase and bolted for the door. Chaos erupted as Kincaid lunged after him, shouting for the other men to stop Dana. But she was faster, drawing her weapon and leveling it at the group. "Don't even think about it," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "It's over, Kincaid. There's no escaping this." Kincaid's hands slowly rose, his calm mask finally cracking. "You have no idea what you've started," he hissed. "This isn't just about me." Dana's eyes narrowed. "Then you better start talking." Before he could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air, drawing closer. Alvarez had called it in, ensuring backup was on the way. As the officers stormed the building, Kincaid's smug confidence dissolved completely. But as Dana watched him being cuffed and led away, a chill ran down her spine. Kincaid's parting words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, this isn't just about me. Asterisk. Dana knew the fight was far from over. She'd exposed one corrupt officer and his accomplice, but the system they operated within was much larger, more insidious. As she stepped into the night, her resolve hardened. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning.